Welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
Hey, James. How's it going? I'm doing great, thanks.
Today we're lucky enough to be welcoming Dr. Sarah Strohmaier onto the show. Sarah is a psychology lecturer and mindfulness researcher at Canterbury Christ Church University. She's got a particular interest in dose when it comes to mindfulness, and we're really excited to have her on. Sarah, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. Hello.
To kick off, I'm interested in how you came to study dose in mindfulness in the first instance, because it's a fairly niche area of research despite being so important.
Absolutely, I agree. So when I first started with mindfulness, I worked as a research associate in a applied psychology institute in the UK. So it's mostly clinical, but also other applied psychologies. And as part of that, we had a mindfulness-based cognitive therapist who just did like a 8-week MBCT program for staff to just sort of help with, everyday stress, give like a taster sort of what mindfulness is all about, things like that. So I went along to that, and that's an 8-week program. Like I said, it's fairly intense. So it has 2.5 to 3 hour weekly group sessions. Then you have home practices that you do. These are like 40 minutes to up to an hour a day that you're doing, and it goes for 8 weeks, and then there's a retreat as well. So I really enjoyed that, but I found it quite intense as well. So I was working full time. As you know, you're doing an hour of home practice every day. So that seems quite intense to fit in every day, I thought, for myself. But I really, really enjoyed the mindfulness aspect of it and had sort of done some of it similar to in my master's already. So what I was doing, what I did afterwards is at Monash, there's the Future Learn course on mindfulness for wellbeing and peak performance, which is like an online course. And I did that one because I really enjoyed it, and it had sort of lower practices. So there were maybe 10-minute practices. There are some sort of reading materials, things like that as well, but much, much shorter practices than the 40, 50 hour long practices. And that really interested me to see, because I found benefits in the lower practices a lot. And I thought, what is the difference? There are so many different programs available on mindfulness. These 8-week programs, longer than 8-week programs. Then there's apps, there's online programs, there's self-help book-based bibliotherapy programs. And I kind of thought, well, what is the best one? What is the relationship? What is the dose that you need to do? Both in clinical populations, but also general populations, because people have responsibilities, they have work, they have dinner to cook, other things to do. How do you know? And I was kind of interested, and then I did my PhD on that to answer that question, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. We talk about this a lot, actually, that contemplative practices are always sort of optimal within a certain bandwidth. But we haven't spoken about dose, but I mean, it makes sense because I think there's a kind of, it seems for me anyway, there can be a sort of thought in the contemplative communities that sort of more is better. You want to be continually growing the amount, and somehow if you can really sit down for a few hours a day, then that's much better than a shorter period of time. But we've had this conversation again and again, it seems, in the recent weeks, that thinking about that in a sort of in too much of a linear way is probably problematic, that it's probably there's going to be a balance. There's going to be a right amount of practice somewhere in the middle that's going to be different for people. So we've been really hot to have you on to talk about this idea of dose.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. And what you're saying there, Mark, about how people start practicing, because I mean there's a lot of mindfulness research out there now, but also the question is about how people start, and sometimes telling someone, that's what I've come across in research anyway, telling someone to start in 40-minute practices or 50-minute practices when they first sit down is quite long. Sitting still for that long is quite tricky for some people. For other people it might be easier. They might find that quite helpful. A metaphor that I use quite a lot is imagine someone who wants to run a marathon, right? So they're sort of the first time they put on their running shoes, you wouldn't expect them to run 42 kilometers or 26 miles, would you?
Exactly.
So you'd like slowly build it up.
No.
Maybe they go for a walk first, maybe they run 1 kilometer, maybe 5 kilometers, maybe 10 kilometers, and then slowly build that up to be able to run a marathon. Also, the other thing is as well, for running marathons, not everyone wants to do that. some people might just keep it at 5K and then that's fine. And you still have health benefits, things like that. You don't have to go to the Olympics and compete, things like that. And it's similar in mindfulness practice as well. There's a lot of benefits being found in shorter but regular mindfulness practices as well. And if that works for someone, why not have that work for some people and then for other people longer practices? Because, two things can be true for people, I think, as well.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things when we talk about mindfulness and dose is that we have a little bit of a job on our hands just to establish what an ideal outcome is, right? Because we talk about dose and the implication is that a certain dose refers to a certain outcome. How do you even go about establishing what a good outcome is, especially given the caveat that we're all different psychologically?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's different, as you say, different outcomes, different things that you can measure as psychologists. So there's things like psychological well-being that you often measure through sort of self-report measures and things like that, where you can see generally how someone's doing in their everyday life. There's clinical measures, there's non-clinical measures, general well-being measures, things like that. There's a bit of a caveat on that, and then obviously there's brain scans and things like that as well. So there's different things we've got available. There's differences in what that means as well, and how you can say, is that good or bad? For some people that might be different, as you say. So often what you do is look at what someone's baseline is and control for that. So before they do the mindfulness practice, complete some measures, and then you can see, what is their normal, thing. Does it improve? Does it change? Does it not change? Things like that as well. Psychology, I think, is tricky also because self-report measures, there's always going to be some degree of bias in them because people complete them themselves. It's interestingly, I had a reviewer recently, though, that said to me, who else can tell someone how they're feeling than the person themselves? You can't really say like, oh, this person looks like they're happy. No. They must be happy. That's another thing.
That's super challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of measures are you most interested in when you're thinking about dose in your research? I mean, what are you looking at that improves? Do you have a sort of subset of things that you're interested in improving in particular?
Yeah, so I think my main area that I'm interested in is well-being measures. So things like people's depression, anxiety and stress levels, not just on a clinical level, but also sort of everyday people. Everyone's stressed sometimes or feeling down or worried about things as well. And sort of how mindfulness can help with that as well. On the other hand, also some brain-related measures could also be interesting, although that is much more tricky with the dose question, because for instance, there's some research that's been completed about really high-level dose experienced practitioners who've been practicing at a high dose for 20, 30 years, several decades, and often what that means, though, you can see what their brain looks like compared to people who aren't experienced meditators, right? But you don't know what their brain looked like when they first started, right?
We have no first picture, do we? Yeah. So we don't really know.
Yeah, so that's a little bit more tricky to do.
Yeah, it's interesting too because when we talk about mindfulness, we assume, and we've just touched on this, we assume the bigger the dose, the better. Because the gym analogy serves here. We just go, well, if you go to the gym lots of times, the evidence is you get more benefit. But, just before we got on air, me and Mark were chatting. And I said my dad, who's in theory quite eccentric, said, well, I want to do exercise, but I'm 68 years old. I want to do the least amount for the most amount of benefit. So I read this paper and got an exercise bike to do 3 minutes of intense exercise a week, on the basis that captured most of the curve for cardiovascular health. Mm-hmm. And the irony was he stopped because it was too much work. But
that's great. I love that.
Which is beyond ridiculous. But there's a wider point here, which is like, is it possible that our assumption about mindfulness isn't so correct when it comes to the benefits and the dose?
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting because at first this is not what I expected to find either. With the maybe starting small might be helpful, but then I talked to some different people, some Buddhists as well, so at conferences. I heard Sharon Salzberg, who's a big mindfulness researcher in the field as well, saying something about that actually starting small is quite normal, what they do in Buddhism as well. I also saw you had Dusana Dorji on there. She's done some research on that, or said that is in traditions as well, starting 5-10 minutes. Now in Buddhism, for instance, that's sometimes younger people, so children that start with these shorter practices, for instance, oftentimes, but then building that up as well. So that's it's not that surprising if thinking about it a little bit more when I've spoken to people and they said, yeah, actually, that makes sense, starting with these short practices. And I think also it makes things more accessible as well, because in research it was found people, are recommended to do some mindfulness practices, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. And a lot of the time people didn't differ in the amount of practice they actually did. So people who were told to do 10 minutes did just as much as people who were told to do 20 minutes. And there's actually no difference. But then the people that were told do 20 minutes and they only did 10 minutes, they might feel a bit more guilty, or they have done it wrong, and then that comes in as well and might not be good for their psychological well-being in that sense. So
This is the really interesting thing about saying, well, there are different options of dose. Because there are only options that this doesn't happen in isolation. This happens in the context of your life. So it's almost on one level silly to speak about doing an hour a day versus 10 minutes a day. If an hour a day is unsustainable given the life of the practitioner, it's a false equivalence. And there's the additional benefit beyond just the fact that you might be able to get some of the benefit of the practice with less time. There's just this point to be made that this doesn't happen in isolation. And therefore, we're interacting and interfacing with our psychology all the time around what is doing quite a difficult thing to sit there and eyes closed and breathing.
yeah.
And we miss that point so often when it comes to this conversation, that like none of it counts unless we're doing it.
Yes, and that's exactly what you were doing there. Shifting in your seat, things like that. I had that exact thing with one of my participants, where in one of my studies where I compared 5-minute mindfulness practices to 20-minute mindfulness practices, and one participant in the 20-minute group found it really hard. And she said, "Isn't there a shorter option?" She said, "I can't sit still for that long." And she was shifting in her seat, and she found it really, really difficult. And for that person, there's other types of mindfulness practices available. So things like walking meditations are quite helpful for some people, where you're walking, you're feeling your feet on the floor, you feel the wind in your hair, things like that as well, and mindfully paying attention to that. So for here's the individual differences thing again. So for some people, 20, 40, 50 minutes, 2 hours might not be a problem. That might be really, really helpful for these people. But other people, it might not be. And I think that's okay. Different things can be helpful for different people. And then there's also things like in informal mindfulness practices, like, mindfully brushing your teeth, mindfully doing the dishes, mindfully, sitting down, drinking a cup of tea, things like that, or coffee or whatever. So that can be really helpful as well. So just paying attention to what you're doing in the moment. It doesn't have to be something really complicated. You don't need a special cushion or something in order to have some benefits for mindfulness as well.
So I think people who are listening today are going to. I think it's easy to buy into the fact that slow and progressive is a good way to train. I think we can all buy into that. That start small, start slow, grow slow. I mean, actually, even though I'm saying that as a meditation teacher, I find myself saying this a lot. So I mean, it must not be so obvious that. Just like you wouldn't go to the gym and try to lift like mega weight all the time from nothing. But people are so quick to do that with their minds, actually. Like, oh, it's no big deal. I'll just try to do, especially very like, I'm a recovering type A personality, and like, it's easy to be like, oh, I love meditation. Wow, I had a breakthrough. So now I'm going to do 3 hours a day from now on is, I think, completely ridiculous. So you want to do it slowly and you want to grow up. So that's good. But what I'm really interested in is, have you found evidence? This is the part that I think is a little less intuitive. What have you found for like the benefits of shorter practices? I mean, are you finding, like, just like Jamie's dad found, this research that even 3 minutes catches most of the benefits when it comes to cardiovascular health? Is there similar sorts of things like that that you're finding in terms of dose with mindfulness? Like, is there an optimal amount, or some really, like, was there anything really surprising that you found? Like, oh, wow, like if you only do it this much, we're seeing kind of this big thing. Have you found anything like that?
Yes, in a sense. I mean, some of these things, there's also a difference in mindfulness with with things like state and trait outcomes. So normally state
Right.
means sort of what the state you're in. So if you might practice mindfulness and you're feeling calm and you're feeling like quite content in the moment as well, but that might not be
Yep.
long lasting necessarily. So if you do it once, it
Right.
might not, become a habit or something that you are
Right, because
continuously.
traits are going to take more time, right? They've got to be more integrated throughout your habit system. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of those differences. So there's, I think in research it would be great to do like a measure of continued practice over several months or even years or something like that. That'd be fantastic to do. But again,
Yep.
that's quite complicated to do and getting people to come in. But I think that's definitely some options for more research there. In terms of the optimal dose, again, I think that's different from person to person again. And I know that's quite an annoying answer because it'd be great to be like, oh, do these 5 minutes and you're sorted. That'd be great, like a prescription drug or something.
Yeah.
I think a little bit I think that's again in psychology, sometimes things are much more complicated than they seem, but I think definitely, I mean, when in my studies that I've done, comparing 5 minutes to 20 minutes and in like a control group who just listens to something else, the surprising thing
Yep.
there was to find 5 minute practices actually being more helpful for psychological distress than the longer practices because of
Wow.
them being so interesting, isn't it?
How come?
Yeah, see, that's the thing I wanted to hear. How interesting
Yeah.
that even 5 minutes of practice is going to have these important benefits, and maybe even more so than the 20-minute practice with beginning meditators who are trying to
Yeah.
alleviate some cognitive distress.
Absolutely.
Is that a reflection of the fact that 5 minutes, beyond 5 minutes, you start to and somehow lose the effect? Or is it that people struggle with the bigger dose?
I think it's more that they struggle with a bigger dose. So in this study, I took people who were novice mindfulness practitioners. So people who have not done mindfulness before, who don't have a regular mindfulness practice, right? So this is different populations. Again, the general population, adults, but not engaging in mindfulness practices. And it was, I think that they hadn't done this before. So it was mindfulness of the breath meditation practice, and then they listened to an audiobook as well. So it's 25 minutes in total, but one group did 20 minutes, one group did 5 minutes. And it was, I think, because it was this, again, very surprising finding, because it's not what we hypothesized either. So we thought, oh, maybe 20 minutes will be better. But actually, I think it's that 5 minutes, this like a taster, or sometimes getting used to this way of listening to something, getting used to paying attention to your breath, which is like a learning thing people have to get into again a little bit more as well. Whereas 20 minutes can be quite difficult already. And people say 20 minutes is short already, there's longer ones as well.
Now I'm starting to see a little bit from what you said a little bit earlier coming into play. You're right. From the 5 to the 20, there's lots of confounding factors for why that might be less beneficial. Like you have self-consciousness about your abilities to do this. You've got lots of doubt. You're new at doing this, so you don't have the skills built for it. 5 minutes is easy because it's novel. 20 minutes is potentially laborious because it is challenging to start with. And there's a lot of misconceptions about what success is. And lots of people are either type A or recovering type A people like I am. And then we don't like to not be good at the things that we're doing. And we don't like to be confused. And I think for a lot of people, we don't like to sit with our own cognitive emotional state much. We're doing a lot of distracting in our world right now, and meditation at a longer dose isn't always very comfortable. And especially if you're starting to move from states to traits and you're doing a little bit more advanced practices, it stops being something. I mean, eventually it does bring great comfort, I think, but the middle part can be a bit rocky. And so of course the higher dose is going to come with some of its own problems, isn't it? That are going to be that you're not going to get maybe at 5. You're not going to get at 5 minutes.
And I think it's also, doses again is a bit of a tricky term because it's quite a medical term, but in my research, I refer to dose as not only practice. So practice is one of the things, amount of practice that you do. There's also other elements. So the frequency, how often you practice a week,
right?
How much you're recommended to practice, that can also influence how much you actually practice. if it's a group practice, if it's a self-help practice, there's all these different areas that also influence. So if you have a teacher, a qualified teacher, that might be quite different. You know, maybe if you had a qualified teacher, you can check in with afterwards. If you do it in a group, that might again be different. So there's lots of different elements affecting this sort of dose response relationship as well.
Anything you found in that part that was interesting or surprising? I mean, in addition to just the length of the sit, but also frequency and suggested frequency and having a teacher that's there to like check in regularly. Anything there pop out?
Yeah, so what I did in a first, before I did the length of practice study, I did a large meta-regression meta-analysis, which is basically like a review of lots of different studies that have already done mindfulness programs, and what they found. And basically, for those programs, so there's over 200 studies, so lots and lots of different doses of mindfulness. And what I found actually for increasing trait mindfulness after a program, more intense programs were more helpful. So actually having more intense programs, so more sessions a week, and also more contact with a facilitator, that was predicted greater levels of trait mindfulness at the end. So for that outcome, not for depression, anxiety, and stress, but for that outcome, more intense sessions and more contact was found more helpful, which makes sense because mindfulness, again, being a skill that's learned. So if you've got someone directly teaching you, might be more helpful than doing it online. Again, more research needs to be done though, because that's not a study, but that was what other people have said in the realm. Things.
That's interesting then, because it raises the question, why didn't it, in the same vein, help more with the depression, anxiety outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's slightly different. There might also be, I mean, there's a few factors. So a lot of the time in these studies, people hadn't done much mindfulness before. So they had quite, limited knowledge of mindfulness at the beginning, not having done it before. And there was much more scope to increase that, Whereas, someone who's not done it, whereas someone who's already got quite a high baseline level of mindfulness. On the other hand as well, sometimes people weren't necessarily clinical samples as well. So that means that they might have, low levels of depression, anxiety and stress to start with, and high doses might not have changed that so much. And low doses might have been more helpful. Other things that I found as well is greater recommended practices actually were found to have higher levels of anxiety and depression at follow-up. So sometimes it's 1 to 4 months follow-up as well, which was interesting. But I'm thinking about, but it's again difficult because we don't know what happens between the post-program and the follow-up for these studies. So they didn't check in or see how much people actually practiced in that period. But it could be that people that were recommended to practice for longer, maybe the 40 minutes, maybe up to an hour a day, they might have found that too challenging to keep up with, in their everyday life, away from the group. Whereas people who were told maybe do 5 or 10 minutes, they might have continued with that. But that's a theory. We don't know if that's what people did, but it would make sense, that.
Yeah. This is just a totally personal opinion here, but I struggle with feeling comfortable with those sorts of programs where you train somebody up to be doing an hour of this emotional, cognitive, introspective, metacognitive training a day, and then you leave them without having a regular teacher that can come back into contact with them to tell them how it progresses when you do. Because an hour is actually, that's a fairly big dose. And you're going to have I think, given enough time, if you're doing that on your own, you're going to have some real changes in the way that you see yourself and the way that you see your thoughts and the way that you see the world. And so, to train, the 5 and 10, you're probably in a very safe window to say now, on your own now, spend 5 minutes a day doing your cognitive hygiene, 15 minutes a day doing cognitive hygiene, doing 8 minutes a day of loving kindness. I mean, I can basically see no problem with that. Yeah. But, training somebody up to an hour and then saying, good luck. And then who knows, because that changes, right? Like if you're practicing an hour a day, lots of things can change. And if you're making even a slight miss, then that can elaborate issues over time. I mean, for instance, like people who think that if the mind is moving, then you're failing. Yeah. When in fact, the moving mind isn't a problem at all. The mind always moves. That's just natural for the mind to move. Rather, you want to become cool with the mind moving in all of its different ways. But lots of people miss that point. I find when I give that talk, and I seem to be giving that talk a lot, people are like, oh, I had no idea.
Yeah.
I thought I was just bad at meditation because my mind moved around, rather than meditation all being about getting a good relationship with your moving mind.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think this is again where the practicality issue comes in, because I know that some courses, so Bruno Cayune from Tasmania in Australia, for instance, he does the MICBT course, and I know he does work with him on a project, but he does like these drop-in sessions, right, for people who've completed this course. And then he does sort of regular drop-in sessions in a group where people can ask questions like, this happened to me, I'm unsure about it, and things like that. That's really helpful, and that's where I think longer practices have been found really helpful. The problem is, I think as well, practically, not everyone can do that as well. So someone who maybe did an online course or did an app-based course or something like that, there might be less help there. So for these people, for instance, it might be helpful to do the 5-10 minutes, and it might still help them with their everyday life. They might not be able to go as deep, obviously not, as someone who practices for longer amounts of time, but it might still help them. And that's where the practicality of things comes in, where things are being made accessible and not just for people who are able to go to a course or attend these courses and have the time to do that as well, which I think is really important.
The other thing where the word dose is interesting is, it's medical, but it often refers to medicine. And with medicine, you have one variable, which is how much you're taking, but you also have the frequency of taking. And, compared to Mark, the 1 hour you mentioned, well, that's 12 doses of 5 minutes. But it seems to me that if you spent 1 hour on day one doing an hour versus 12 days in a row of 5 minutes, it seems like you're doing quite a different activity there as far as the brain is concerned. And I was wondering whether that came through in your research.
Yeah, so that's a difference there. So you've got the dose of a single practice, and then you've got the dose of the total practices that you do. So for instance, as well, sometimes someone who does 5 minutes but does that more regularly might end up with more at the end, quantity-wise, than someone who does an hour once and then nothing afterwards. So for mindfulness, I think generally regularity is more important than doing something once and then nothing for the rest of the time as well. So it's all about training your mind, getting your mind used to things, and then doing these informal mindfulness practices that I mentioned as well, sort of, being more mindful in everyday life as well is more helpful than sort of just doing the one long practice and then not doing
Yeah, right, because there's an analogy here, isn't there, with the leaking bucket?
Yes.
And the mindfulness is great, but the dose of the formal practice must be sort of supported by the dose of the everyday practice, which I think people can quite typically find easier.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's again where it's slightly different from medicine. Maybe I'm not a medical doctor or anything, but if someone had maybe an allergic reaction, you give them an EpiPen and they're fine, sort of thing. And then that's done until the next allergic reaction maybe. But in psychology, I think our minds are much more complex. It's like there's a lot of stress going on all the time. And unfortunately, that's just how it is. It's not going to go away because we did a mindfulness practice once. There's going to be more. And sort of training your mind to become, as you say, the stress bucket as well. So keeping that low, because there'll be more things coming in, but sort of being able to work with that, being able to feel less anxious, less worried about things, but being in the present moment as well. Not worrying about the past, ruminating about the past, and not worrying about future things, what's going to happen next, because that's all the things that then fill the stress bucket as well.
Yeah, and there's also, just this conversation is bringing out for me how many different uses of mindfulness there really are. Because you really can use mindfulness as an attempt to blow up your initial perceptions of what it is to be a self and a human being on this planet. But you can also use it to help you manage your day. And it seems that dose, we never speak about this enough, how linked dose actually in fact is to your specific outcome you have in mind, and probably as a result the importance of clarifying your outcome.
Yes.
Yeah, so no wonder some people are running into trouble, right? Because you're not thinking about dose. Well, you're maybe not thinking clearly about dose, Jamie. You're exactly right. Figure out what your goal is for practicing in these ways, and then consider the right dose. consider where you are on the training program. Remember that it is a training. I mean, Sarah, I mean, you just keep saying it again, and I hear it again and again as you say, mind training. And it is a training. You're going to a sort of mental gym here and you're training something. So to get clear about what your goal is and to get clear about where you are and then to select the right dose and to remember that the dose is going to change depending on what you're trying to develop and where you are in your training cycle. I mean, that even happens for athletes, right? Some days you train harder, some days you train weaker. And for a good athlete, you're going to know when the big days are, when the high load days are, and when the low load days are. But I don't hear, and I would love to hear more of this because I definitely practice like this. I don't hear a lot of people talking about this manual adjusting for optimal outcomes, but we could be maybe thinking about that like that.
And I think again that's it's interesting what you said, Jamie, as well, and Mark, looking at what is it that you're trying to find out as well. So another analogy that I use sometimes, because I like analogies, it's nice.
Yeah,
like someone,
exactly.
You know, it's like someone if you're trying to learn a language, right? Say like someone wants to learn Italian because they want to go on holiday and order an ice cream or something like that, right? So that you've got that level of this is my goal, that's what I want to do. I want to go to Italy, order an ice cream or something. But if someone wants to like go to Italy, go to university, you know, do intellectual conversations with Italian,
read Dante in the
Dante,
original,
things like that.
Yeah.
Exactly. That might be a different goal, and then you might need to adjust the amount of practice that you do, Italian learning practice. Similarly,
so
that might be similar in mindfulness as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got a little bit of pain. Like my mom was just dealing with hip pain and she did the Headspace app on pain, which I think Headspace is just such a great way to it's such a soft edged way of doing meditation, I think, because it's very short, they're low doses. And she did the pain course and she had real epiphany, She started looking at her pain a couple minutes a day, actually changed her relationship with her pain and really had a different experience of her relationship with pain. She doesn't need to do more than that. That's all she wanted out of it. She wanted to, she's got in a little bit of persistent low grade pain. She just wanted to work a little bit with her own appreciation, her own approach to pain. And so a very low dose over a very low amount of frequency over a short period of time was all she needed to kind of get the habit of being like, oh, I'm in a bit of pain. Wait, let me take a look at it rather than turning away from it. And wow, look, like it is just sort of signals in the body rather than being something totally weird. And look, I feel good in all of these other places, even though I have a little pain here. She was able to pick that up in low doses, low set, but that was it. So if you're coming at contemplative training thinking, oh, I just like to get a better relationship with my pain, but then you're listening to a teacher who's like an hour a day is what you need from now on. You might have your wires crossed there because the teacher might not be talking about a small update in how you understand your pain. They might be like, yeah, if you really want to get on this path and you really want to see transformative, awakened states start to emerge, then this is what you need to be doing. But you got to be really clear there because those are very different.
And I think that's fantastic. It's great that that worked for your mum as well. And it's not to say
Yeah.
that longer mindfulness practice aren't helpful. There's lots of research saying that the high doses are really, really helpful for
Right.
people as well. So I think it's just that it's one of those things where more than one thing can be true. Like low
Sure.
doses can be helpful for someone like your mum with pain management, or higher doses can be really helpful for other people who want to get more emerged towards that. And I think there's also individual differences there for what people want and also what helps people to get started with, to continue with higher doses. I think it's great to have a variety of different things. I think that's good.
Yeah, so just one thing I want to just pull out there and say out loud because I think it's important and it comes up now. But just how good it is for us as a contemplative community, because most people who are coming on the show are also people who are doing these practices, and I definitely am, to remember that just like with medicine and just like exercise, being mindful of what you're after and being mindful of the outcomes and then adjusting the dose relative to those things seems like a really wholesome and a really protective practice, because then you can watch and you can monitor. Oh, that's not quite enough. Let's lift it up. Oh, that seems to be a little bit too much stress and strain. Let's lower it down. And you would do that with medication as well. And you would do it with exercise prescription as well. My wife is a physio and she's all the time toggling people's exercise regimes based on the outcomes. And though you don't know the outcomes at first, you have to be like, how is it going? Yeah. Oh, it's going good. Great. Then, keep going. Or it's not going well, then let's adjust. And maybe if we could think about our contemplative training programs like that, I think that would be beneficial.
Absolutely.
Yeah, something else that's just emerging here too is Mark, you said your mum kind of learnt the technique and now can apply that. So she heard the clip, did the practice, and now that same practice can be applied. And there's effectively two things happening here, right? One is you can learn a technique. Now, part of that is doing it, and part of it is like, this is the thing you do, like an instruction.
Right.
And that's a slightly different thing to your brain needs to change by doing the repetition of mindfulness. And it seems like a lot of the benefits of mindfulness takes that instructive element. Like, you just need to nail the first bit, try it a few times, and now that's in the locker. And it seems like that would be a very good reason why low doses are effective, because you can carry the lessons forward.
And similarly, I think as well with, that's a really good point that you make it there. I think it's also about instructed, so guided practices. So a lot of the time, earlier on, people have guided practices. So someone saying, reminding people to, concentrate on their breath. In apps, they do that a lot, like Headspace, Inside Timer, Calm, all those sort of guided practices. But a lot of the time, people who are more experienced meditators, they have less guided practices as well, where that skill element comes in. So it's like learning that skill, knowing what to do first in. And I think that's where it's again similar to other skills that you might be learning. Maybe learning a language is skills like that. Later on, you don't need to go on on your Facebook or whatever it is you're looking at.
Yeah.
I think that's the same with that. And I think often with mindfulness, because it's a different way, it can be helpful to start small and start at like, oh, okay, this is a different thing I'm doing now, rather than starting with long practices, which does help for some people, but I think for others as well, it can be quite tricky. And just getting used to things slowly, because your mum might have, I don't know, I'm assuming if someone said, oh, sit down and do an hour and a half of this practice, she might have been like, no.
It would have much worse outcomes. It would have totally worse outcomes. Of course, it would have had worse outcomes.
Or
Absolutely.
She might not have done it at all. That's a lot of the things that we see as well.
No.
And I think
Exactly
there's
right.
a lot of assumptions as well with mindfulness, coming, contemplative practices as well, that you need to have some sort of baseline skills to be able to do that. You need to be a certain calm person. You need to be able to sit cross-legged, all these other things, which is not true, which you don't have to do. But I think sometimes there's these assumptions of what you need to be able to do in order to get the benefits, in order to have something helpful coming from it as well.
Sarah, is this interest in dose and mindfulness, is this still on your radar for future research? Are you brewing anything now for new studies that are going to be coming out, or what's the sort of next big question in this chain?
I think there's a lot more to do in dose research. So there's a lot more questions that haven't been answered yet. I mean, it's interesting that there's been so much research on the different doses, but no one's looked at, hang on, what's the mechanisms, or not many people have looked at the mechanisms. And there's a lot more to look into, looking at the whole group versus individuals. What is the difference there? So if your mum had done a group mindfulness practice, would 20 minutes have been more helpful? What would have been, what is the thing there? Also the different types of practice potentially that could be helpful. So a lot of the time, things like a mindfulness of the breath meditation practice is quite a standard one that is used quite a lot, just because the breath is readily available. You don't need anything else. You've got it already, right? But then there's other types of practices. You talked about loving kindness practices, that's a slightly different practice. All these different types of practices and how they're different. There's also been a lot of research looking at mindful inductions. So this is mindfulness or studies that are a single mindfulness practice, and you see what the state outcomes are. So after a 10-minute practice, what is the outcome, for instance, or a 15-minute practice? Then that obviously can't see what the long-term, practices are. This, is just having a look at what happens after one practice for these outcomes as well. And also looking at other outcomes. So I've done a study as well on positive psychological outcomes. For instance, are people more hopeful after a mindfulness practice? Or what is gratitude? Gratitude is quite an interesting one as well. So people feel more grateful after a mindfulness practice, because that's been linked to increased well-being outcomes as well. So there's a lot of different ones. I think also with the pandemic having so many things online, there's a difference with online mindfulness programs. There's a lot more things to understand, I think. So there's a lot more I'd like to find out about those, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the hope and gratitude bit there, is that evidence you already have back, or is that something that's still in the cooker?
Yeah, so that's a paper I was published, I think, in January this year. So it's a mindfulness induction randomized control trial where we had two groups. So one group did a mindfulness practice, the other group listened to something, the history of the universe, something completely different.
Nice.
And then having a look, also interesting, I think, but different. No instructions there. But then looking at, after a single mindfulness practice, what is the difference in state hope and state gratitude outcomes? Having a
And what did you find?
So those increased levels of state gratitude and state hope, also mediated by state mindfulness. So individuals that had a greater change in state mindfulness, so they're feeling, in the moment, they're feeling greater mindfulness. That also meant they had greater levels of gratitude and greater levels of hope as well. So there's a relationship there.
Lovely.
And
how long was how big was the dose?
So that was a 10-minute practice, a single 10-minute practice as well. So quite interesting.
Was it frequency or just one practice?
Just one practice. So that's a mindfulness induction, which is just one practice to see what the mechanisms are, more so than long-term changes. But they can inform these long-term changes as well.
Got it. Fascinating.
Yeah, there's also a practical edge here, right? Because for meditators onto both ends of the objective spectrum, on the one hand, I just want to improve my life a little bit. And on the other, I'm a serious practitioner. Dose is important, and dose is something you actually wrestle with without realizing you're wrestling with every time you make a decision to practice. So my first question is, what is the practical edge to this advice or of this research for beginners?
So that's I think that's a great question, because I think a lot of the time as an academic or scientist, we answer all of these questions. We've got all of these things that we want to find out, and then we find them out, and then we publish them, and then it doesn't really reach outside of academia, or sometimes it does. So I think that's one of the important things, especially with things like well-being outcomes, or things that people can do to help with their well-being or improve their lives, and something that they might find helpful for pain management, like your mum, or people being stressed and having lots to do, and something that can help. Not that it is a panacea, because that's the other end of the extreme, because that's quite dangerous as well. Mindfulness is seen as like the cure for everything. But
definitely.
But I think definitely there is something that can be helpful in this practical side of things, that you can do brief mindfulness practices. You can build these up, maybe have these regularly, and then it can help you in your everyday life. It can help you, not everyone as well. So some people might not find it helpful, and that's fine as well. They might find going for a walk more helpful, or exercising, or whatever. Yeah.
And what about those who are on sort of the deep end of the spectrum and consider themselves fairly serious practitioners?
I think that's another thing that I'm looking at the moment, at looking at experienced meditators and how that looks differently to novice meditators or non-meditators, because I think that would be something really interesting to explore further as well. So I've done quite a bit of research with these novice meditators who, limited previous experience of mindfulness, haven't done much of it. But I'd also like to look into more what motivates someone to go further. What is there an element of individual differences? What makes someone want to sit down and practice maybe for an hour or 2 hours, or go on these longer retreats as well? So what is the mechanism there, and how do they find it helpful? Also, if they didn't do that, how would it impact their lives? What would the difference be if they stopped practicing mindfulness? That's quite a difficult thing to research, though, because you don't want to tell people not to do something that they find helpful. Again, that's quite tricky to do.
We'd like you to sit on the couch now for a month and just watch Netflix. Don't exercise, and we want to see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. But also on both of those ends, I think there are so many questions to be answered. What motivates someone to do that? What is their practice? Why did it change? Why did they start practicing? Why did they increase the practice? If they did, what is the most benefit they find out about that? And I think there's a lot of areas there to explore as well, which would be great.
Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. Where can everybody find you online?
Thank you very much for having me. I've got a few things. You can find me on Twitter at Sarah Strohmaier. I also have a website, which is sarahpsychology.com, which might be easier to spell than my surname. Otherwise, I think I can give you the links for my LinkedIn or my ResearchGate for those academics who want to find out more about my research as well. But yeah, otherwise, those Twitter or website would be good.
Sarah, thanks so much for coming on, and everyone, thank you for listening, wherever you are. This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast, and as always, we will see you next week.